Today I'm interviewing Rabbi Samuel Burstein in Port Washington, New York, and today is December 3rd, 1974. I wanted to know, first of all, where and when did you first encounter Jewish survivors of the Holocaust? Who were these people? Were they concentration camp victims or individuals who hid during the war? And what was your response to them?
It was in November 1947 that I went on active duty with the United States Army as a chaplain, a Jewish chaplain, assigned specifically to aid in the supervision and inspection of displaced persons camps. There were a number of chaplains doing that sort of work. We were not considered officially Army chaplains. Our main concern was with the displaced persons, as well as Jews who might have entered the German economy under the laws at that time. Refugees from Poland, Russia, and so on did have the option of leaving the displaced persons camps and becoming citizens of Germany. I was assigned to an army office working out of Kassel, Germany, in the province of Hesse. The office there was in charge of about 30 displaced persons establishments, residences, hospitals, orphan homes, even a training farm. In those installations, there were about 20,000 Jewish displaced persons and about 10,000 non-Jewish displaced persons. They were kept in separate camps, inasmuch as some of the displaced persons, especially Latvians, had been persecutors of the Jews in their own countries originally and had fled Russia because they would have been prosecuted as war criminals. The Jews that I met, this was November 1947 until the summer of 1948, when I was discharged from active duty, were mostly people who had spent the war years in Russia, many of them going to what was considered the most far-out place, Uzbekistan. About a quarter in the camps at the time I was there had survived the concentration camps in Germany. However, most of the concentration camp survivors had already made their way to Palestine or Israel, legally or otherwise. The nature of the people that I worked with is described in my book, Rabbi with Wings. They were people, most of whom had survived by using their wits. It was necessary for them to engage in all sorts of technically criminal activity in order to manage to keep their lives going. There were very few families that had managed to remain together. There were some families that were reunited after the war, but most of them had lost part or all of their families. The nature of the people themselves required a great deal of understanding of their background. Most of the American military personnel did not like the Jewish DPs. The Jewish DPs were not as well educated nor as well brought up as were, for example, the Latvians, who had been aristocrats in their own country. The Jewish DPs had suffered more during the war. The better educated ones, the more delicate ones, had suffered more from the deprivation of work camps in Russia and the travel than, you might say, the more physical types. The level of Jewish education was, I would say, about the same as that in the United States, in the average American Jewish community, as I describe in my book and also in an article published in Gesher, a magazine published by Kibbutz Hadati in Israel about 1948. I mentioned before that these people lived technically outside of the law. There were many restrictive laws with regard, for example, to economic behavior, which these people had to violate in order to make a living. Many of the Druze, it is true, engaged in black market or what is called black market activities. In the United States, these would be termed free market activities. It was the only way they could manage to survive as wanderers through Russia and Poland during the war and after the war. It was the only way they were able to put to use the routine food and other supplies given to them by UNRWA, IRO, Joint, International Red Cross, and other welfare organizations, the Quakers as well. They could trade these items on the open market with Germans for foods which they might not be receiving from the welfare organizations. This had them run afoul, of course, of the various laws intended to strengthen the German economy, economic controls on buying and selling, and so on. Crimes against human beings were almost non-existent in the DP camps. I am sure, and this was my impression at the time, although I did not have any statistics, that the rate of murder in the general German community was much higher than it was in the DP camps. During the time that I was working with these 20,000 or so Jews, time being, again, from November 47 till about June 48, only one Jew was killed in a camp, and that seemed to have been a crime of passion. There were occasional fistfights having to do with politics, but the people, without any police over them, were able to live a very orderly life, very little personal theft, very little violence, even though people were living with many families crowded in together in one room. There was something about the people, perhaps the hope of eventually leaving the displaced persons camps, either for Israel or other lands of refuge, that kept them going. I would like to think that there was a certain amount of momentum having to do with their Jewish background, whether directly or indirectly, which made it possible for them and gave them the courage and the wisdom to develop their own society according to rules of mutual respect and respect for human life as well as the property of other individuals.
Keep going.
And that's all I can think of on that topic.
Okay, fine. How important was it for these Jews, for these DPs, to have a Jewish chaplain there?
The chaplains assigned to this duty had been part of the American Army administration. I don't know whose idea it was at first. I was brought into the picture by Major Abraham Hyman, who at that time was working under Haber, who was the head of Joint, I believe, or who may have been the advisor on Jewish affairs to the commanding general at the time.
I thought it was Sam Haber.
There are two brothers.
Yes, Sam and
One was active with Hort and one was there. I don't know which is which. During the time that the concentration camps were uncovered by American military forces, and this happened as well with the British, the chaplains, as the only officially recognized and defined Jews in the armed forces, took the lead in assisting people in the DP camps. The Army, and again I don't know who started this, it may have been Philip Burstein or others, the Army began to assign special chaplains as the number of troops began to diminish. The Army began to assign special chaplains to this special work of serving as liaison between the United States Army and the DPs, especially the Jewish DPs. This made the DPs feel more comfortable in that somebody recognizably Jewish was engaged in talking to them and protecting their rights. As was to be expected, they did not have confidence in anyone especially anyone who is not Jewish, because of their suffering both in Poland and in Russia, and later on in Germany, and their feeling that the Army and the international refugee organizations were not treating them fairly. This feeling, of course, may or may not have been justified. They had no way of knowing just what the resources were that were available for helping them. The DPs, the Jewish DPs, felt that they could trust the Jewish chaplains, and the chaplains served as a way of explaining to the DPs what the United States authorities could and could not do, and the chaplains also served in advising their commanding officers, who were responsible for civil administration, including the DPs, as to just what the Jewish feelings were. In some instances, the chaplains merely served as interpreters between the DPs, most of whom spoke only Yiddish, and the American authorities, most of whom spoke only English. In some cases, the DPs, and my predecessor Abraham Klausner had a great deal of success in this, were able to organize schools, arrange for the publishing of textbooks, enter into internal camp disputes and try to correct them. I myself had to do this from time to time.
Can we be specific about that?
There was one time when there was a political dispute, typical of the kind we have in the United States, where one political party won a bare majority of the vote and started giving jobs around to all the members of their own party. I was able to persuade the winning party that the effective workers who had been in the camp administration before should be kept no matter what political party they belonged to. Incidentally, by the time I arrived there was a very high percentage of revisionists in the DP camps. I don't know whether the fact has ever been called to public attention, but there was an immigration quota into Palestine and Israel worked out by the political parties in Israel, whereby the political affiliation of DPs would be kept in mind, and the percentage of immigrants would be in proportion to the percentage of a political party in the elections in the Asifat HaNivcharim in Palestine. This meant that those people who were registered in the laborite groups had first call on the travel arrangements. The revisionists, being a very small party, had a proportionately smaller representation in the early immigration. Eventually, all those who wanted to get to Israel were able to get there. However, priority was given to immigrants on the basis of political allegiance rather than on the basis of color, creed, nationality, race, and so on. The system was most likely justified on the grounds that some sort of priority had to be established. This registration and emphasis on political party also played a role when the immigrants came to Israel. People were registered on the immigration lists at Haifa according to their political affiliation. This undoubtedly had an effect, and there were DPs who told me that it did, on housing, on job placement, and so on. So that there was a quota system, not only among those who had been living in Palestine and Israel for many years, but among the immigrants, tied in, again, not with place of origin as it has been in the United States, but tied in with political affiliation. One of the questions on the immigration questionnaire, which I myself filled out because I traveled to Israel as a displaced person, was the political party affiliation of the individual. There was another trial where I attended. I don't remember what the
case was where the litigants had to swear on a Torah even though they were not of religious background, or at least of religious sentiment. But the general feeling was, even among the atheists and anti-religionists, that this would guarantee a reliable oath. There was another case where I had to intervene, where a member, or rather a resident of a DP camp, used to travel back and forth between Berlin and Eschwege, which is on the border of the Russian-occupied zone, and owed some money either to someone else in the camp or to one of the organizations in the camp, and they kept him from leaving the camp and making his business trip to Berlin, asking that he repay the debt. I have a vague recollection of being able to persuade the people in charge to let him go on this trip to Berlin so that he would be able to earn the money to pay this debt. And I pointed out to them that the chances of his trying to stay in Berlin or trying to go anyplace else were very, very slim, inasmuch as his family and everything that he possessed was in the Eschwege camp. From time to time, DPs would come to my office and ask me to go out to their camps to settle personal quarrels, which would sometimes cause me some concern as to whether I was getting too personally involved in petty details of their lives. And in fact, my commanding officer told me to try to avoid this type of intervention. There were times when I and the other DP chaplains would have to give reports to the United States Army as to conditions in the camp. Sometimes, again, this might challenge our own ideas as to, and our own feelings as to whether our loyalties lay with the DPs or with the Army authorities. The Army, however, the Army of Occupation, seemed to have very good sources of information within the DP camps. They knew, for example, how many DPs were leaving illegally, of course, but publicly known, were leaving to go to Israel before the outbreak of the war. They got reports, I know that my commanding officer got reports about every 2 weeks as to the number of people leaving each week, the number of people of military age leaving each week from the DP camps in our area. This information might have been provided by the Jewish authorities as a way of cooperating with the American military authorities, who were very anxious to aid any Jews who wanted to get to Palestine and later to Israel, to leave the American zone of occupation and get to Palestine or Israel.
You said that you worked with other Jewish chaplains. Who are they, and how did this work?
The one that I worked with most closely was the one that I replaced. It was Abraham Klauser, now at Yonkers, New York. And I tried to continue in the work that he had done, but it was not as effective as he had been. He had been working at this since he had been on active duty in 1944, 43 perhaps. And I think he was the first chaplain, or one of the earliest American chaplains, into Bergen-Belsen. He organized a central committee of She'erit HaPleita, an organization which exists to this day, and also engaged in illegal emigration of Jews. He was active in the Exodus emigration. He assisted the Exodus people in getting back to Israel after they had been returned to Germany by the British. I didn't have very much contact with other chaplains doing the same kind of work that I was doing. We were all very busy in our own areas. There were others that I met, most of whose names I've forgotten. There was one, Leon Adler, who I think is now in Baltimore or near Washington, D.C.
Kensington, Maryland.
who, like myself, as I recall, had not been a chaplain during hostilities, but was able to become a chaplain, a DP chaplain, about the time that I went to Europe. He was sent home or went home after he was caught taking a group of DPs over some international border, either taking them or visiting them at an illegal camp, which was, as I had heard it at the time, which was suddenly surprised by an inspection team with his own commanding general in it. I may have him mixed with someone else. I hope the story doesn't embarrass him at this
Well, I
stage.
spoke to him and he did not mention to me that about that. Now, I noticed...
I mentioned in the book
That's
some
right.
chaplain without the name.
Right. You mentioned on page 19 of Rabbi with Wings that during my tour of duty in Germany, one of my colleagues was discharged from the army for lending his passport to a brecha.
Now, that was
Right.
either Adler or Mike Abramowitz, who's now down in Florida.
Right.
Mike Abramowitz later worked for JDC in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was either one of those two men. I think the statute of limitations has
He's elapsed. Another was caught leading a group of refugees across the Austrian border.
It might have been one of those, it might have been someone else. I don't
Mhm.
remember. I purposely forgot the names.
Okay, fine. No, I just thought perhaps there might be an interesting story.
Yeah, now you could check with Adler or check with Abramowitz.
Well, Rabbi Adler said that they didn't have anything of that nature to tell me. So it's perhaps...
But I do remember his leaving early, let's say,
mm-hmm.
and unexpectedly. And I think the same thing happened to Abramowitz.
Uh-huh. Now, you alluded to some type of conflict that might have existed between what the Army wanted and what you wanted as a Jewish chaplain. Could you be more specific?
The Army was concerned with maintaining law and order, which meant keeping the Jews in the DP camps, keeping them from bartering things with the German farmers, which would technically be called black marketing. A better term would be free marketing or open marketing. The Army was concerned with other illegal activities. In some of the DP camps, Klausner before me and I myself had to cut down and try to keep DPs from manufacturing alcohol and vodka. There had been an incident during the time Klausner was there of some American soldiers who had gotten poisoned from alcoholic drinks bought in a DP camp.
Mm-hmm.
The main concern with the Army, I got the feeling, was to keep the DPs away from the Germans. I think primarily to avoid what the Army must have considered the DPs as a source of infection, especially with regard to economic crimes, which Jews specialize in, since that's been our area of specialization. And there was, of course, a certain amount of anti-Jewish feeling, both before and as a result of the contact with the DPs who were living in hovels, while even the German civilians were living in clean quarters. As far as the official policy, I heard reports, and I have no reason to doubt them, that at the top level, say from the time Eisenhower was in charge, and then I think Clay and someone else, I think the official policy of the top level of the United States Army was to give the Jews every assistance in getting to Palestine, even though it was illegal, and later on to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that this was done was by having the Jews in the American zone leave from a port in the British zone, so that the authorities in the American zone could say they did not let any DPs leave to go to Palestine or Israel. The Jews in the British zone would leave from the American zone, so that the British could claim that none of their DPs, as far as they knew, ever left to go to
What you're saying is
Palestine.
the British acceded to this?
Yes. The British would let DPs, say from Bergen-Belsen,
Mm-hmm.
travel down to Munich. In fact, I have pictures of a transport of children going to Israel from Bergen-Belsen. And the British could say, straight-faced, that they did not know of any of their own DPs leaving from their area, going to Palestine.
At what level do you think the British were willing to help?
Well, I know that it was done. I heard that in the United States Army it was done straight from the top office of UCOM.
Right.
I would assume that the British were also doing it with some higher-ups. Apparently, the higher-ups did have accurate figures of how many were leaving.
How do you, how did the United States know what was going on? The United States Army know what was going on with regards to the refugees? They seem to have had very
They must have
accurate
had inside informants.
Jews.
Most likely Jews. I was shocked the first time I heard a Jewish DP say to an MP, an American MP, "Why are you arresting me? That other fellow has been committing the same crime." I felt, being taught that Jews should stick together, that you don't do that. But then I realized, when I had more contact with American Jews and people in general, that people are that way. The desire to save one's own skin will very often lead one to break, you might say, group discipline. However, in general, there was a very strong discipline among the DPs, which showed itself in their personal behavior toward each other. They would shout and yell at each other, very seldom get into fistfights. Maybe something, as I mentioned before, not genetically, but in Jewish tradition, which sifts down even to the second or third or fourth generation away from traditional Jewish practice. So they did have that. That was the thing that struck me most, that I would expect people of that sort living in the worst of slum conditions to commit crimes against each other, but the crime rate was practically non-existent. Now, the lower echelons that had, in the army, that had personal contact with the Jews, most of them had the general non-Jewish attitude toward Jews, xenophobia and so on. Added to that was the condition of the Jews, living in poverty and so on. That and since the poverty, of course, was not of the Jews' making, but the poverty brought with it the absence of cleaning supplies, absence of good clothing and so on, so that the American soldiers, the MPs and others, had contact with what might be termed a very sad element of the Jewish community, so that their tendency would be not to develop sympathy but contempt, considering the intellectual and prejudicial background of the average American citizen. There were some American soldiers who, more or less non-Jews, who sided with the DPs and did what they could to help. There were quite a number of American soldiers who worked with the DPs in black market activities, because a lot of black marketing, or open marketing as I prefer to call it, free marketing, was done with American military supplies, which could only be gotten through American contacts. I think there was some counterfeiting either of American money or of military script money, in which some Jews were involved, but which again, as I heard at the time, involved a large number of United States military police. What were we on there? I think I wanted to feel.
We were talking about conflicts between what the army...
Another factor that led many American military personnel to dislike the Jews, and I heard a general once inspecting a camp express this thought.
Do you remember which?
No. It was some visiting general. The DPs tried to put all their wealth into easily transportable items, which meant fancy cameras, gold watches. Golden Zager was considered a big treasure in those days. From time to time, the thing to get was changed. At the time that I was there, everybody was told the Golden Zager would be the best thing to take to Israel because it would have the greatest appreciation of value. So that an American soldier visiting or inspecting a DP camp would see a DP owning a watch that the American soldier could not afford, or owning a Leica camera that the American soldier, even a general, could not afford. And so they very often, as this general, expressed the thought, well, this Jew owns a camera that I can't afford. Why do we have to support him? Why do the international agencies have to support him? Why do we have to protect him against the Germans? Maybe the Germans were right that these Jews are rich. Now, I think I've mentioned this in my book. The American did not realize that this was all the property this Jew owned. The Jew did not have a bank account. He did not have a pension, such as the army man had. He didn't have a home back in the States, such as this general had. He didn't own a car. But because the Jews had these small luxury items, which would be easily transportable to whatever land they ended up in, it gave the impression that they had luxuries which engendered a certain amount of envy on the part of the American military at the point of contact with them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether the Yukon generals knew that Jews had golden Zagers and like cameras, but the men who had daily contact did know that.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you have any contact with any JDC workers?
Yes, I worked more actually with JDC people and Jewish Agency for Palestine people than I did with the Army.
Mm-hmm.
There was a man who was in charge of the JDC office when I was there who is now in charge of the LL office, I think in Chicago. His name is Michael Englard. He might be worth getting in touch with because he was working with JDC, which is close to the chaplaincy work. And he might be able to tell how the chaplains helped him. The New York office might be able to tell you how to get in touch with him. He had originally been in Germany. I mentioned him in my book, but I spelled his name wrong. He came out of Germany. He went back after the war to try to get some of his own family property. And even though he came back from Palestine, he was... No, I don't remember whether he was JDC or Jewish Agency for Palestine. I think he was the JDC supervisor or organizer for that area.
Mm-hmm.
I worked very closely with the Jewish Agency for Palestine people whom I mentioned in my book. The Jewish Agency people were primarily concerned with education, establishing schools of, again, different political parties. As in Israel there are the 3 school systems, so in the DP camps each political party and each religious group had its own school system. The Jewish Agency people tried to arrange summer camps for the kids. That was their way of differentiating their task from that of joint, which was primarily concerned with seeing that every Jew got his cigarettes each week, which they would trade, of course. Ort was active in running factories. I remember maybe in the first or second month I was there, somebody representing Ort, somebody from a DP camp, I think, invited me to go see the new factory they had established, the stocking factory. The factory turned out to be about 30 women sitting in a room, seated around the walls of the room, facing the center of the room, all knitting stockings. That was their factory. However, they did have trade schools. I have pictures of one of the displays the trade school put on. There are other groups that I worked with. I think there was a Quaker there. There was a Frenchman who spoke perfect English, but used a French intonation, so it took a half hour to realize he was talking English. I think he represented another international group. There were workers from England. I forget what name they were called, Jewish Relief Society or something of that sort. So that actually I spent more of my time and energy working with these groups than working out in my office. The only thing my office required was that I inspect the camps from time to time, which was the main job of our office. I serve as interpreter. I never let my office know I didn't know any Yiddish, but I picked it up. I serve as interpreter to go along with some of our men when they have to visit a camp, to give information about what was going on in the camp, some of which information I did not pass along, but which they seemed to get from other sources. There were, incidentally, Jews, DPs, and American Jews working in the CID and other Army undercover groups. I met a fellow who had been working with them in Israel, settled in Israel later on, a DP. And I remember meeting an American who would always, when talking to me or other Jews, would throw in Yiddish words, and sometimes Hebrew words to show that he was on our side. Because the wartime situation of the conflict and the adversary situation was still very much in evidence. Only this time it was between the DPs and the people who were controlling them, namely the United States Army.
Now, in working with these other groups, JDC, Jewish Agency, etc., what was your role? In other words, what was your function in that group?
Sometimes it would be just working for them as an individual. Sometimes they would ask me to try to get equipment from the United States authorities. I heard a story when I left my congregation in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. I'd been there for 8 years. When I visited one time, one of my members said, there's a retired general who lived 3 blocks from you during all those 8 years, who knew you in Germany, but he didn't want you to know that he was here. And apparently at one time I had gone to his office to get supplies for a summer camp, either surplus Army equipment or to borrow Army equipment. And I didn't remember the incident. I remember going to an officer to get something, but apparently he felt that I had given him a very rough time. And now, even in retirement, he didn't want me to know that he knew that I was there. So that part of the job of the chaplain was to do what he could to get supplies from the Army, to deal with other occupation authorities. There was one time when I had to arrange for the funeral of this man I mentioned before who had been killed in Jägerflugzeug. There was nobody who could arrange for the funeral. I had to run to the German bureau to get a death certificate and so on. There were times when people would have complaints about the administration, let's say, of some hospital, which I would have to look into. Very often the complaints were unfounded. Sometimes they were founded. There were times when I would have to intercede or try to bring pressure on local German authorities to let a Jewish group use a building, a public building, which they wanted to give to some Germans. And they had plenty of Germans who didn't have homes, and they would rather give them the use of a building or the use of a camp facilities, let us say, than let Jews or DPs of any sort use, let's say, a hotel for quartering for a few weeks, or some abandoned children's summer camp. They'd rather put their own people in than let the DPs use it as a camp. So that I would have quite a bit of work along those lines, some of which I would tell my commanding officer in the Army, some of which I would do more or less on my own. The DP chaplains were supposed to have a lot of freedom, something which my immediate superior did not know.
Who was that?
I think his name was Wills or Mills. He was a major. The colonel in my office was a fellow named Sinsel, S-I-N-S-E-L. And Wills or Mills either did not know or did not want to let me know that he knew that I was supposed to have a great deal of freedom. I once wrote a letter to Haber, I think it was, and he became very upset that it did not go through Army channels. If it had gone through Army channels, it never would have reached Haber. And there are always these sources of friction or misunderstanding. There are times when I had difficulty getting transportation, even though we were supposed to be assigned our own transportation. Whether he did it out of any special feeling, or whether he felt this was the Army way of doing things, and I was under his command. At one time, he wanted me to move back into the Army quarters at Fritzlar. Klausner before me and I had been living in a hotel where other Army personnel were quartered in the city of Kassel, which is more convenient both for the Gemeinde. There were about 100 Jews in Kassel who decided to join the German economy there and become Germans. They had a little synagogue of their own, which I visited from time to time. So these people could come to visit the chaplain. They couldn't go all the way up to Fritzlar, which was about 12 miles away. The largest DP camp was in Kassel, the outskirts of Kassel. So that Klausner and I found it easier to be living in Kassel, to be available to our people, and where they would feel they could talk to the chaplain as a chaplain, or to this Jew as a Jew, rather than have to go into an army office, which for all they knew might have been bugged or whatever, to talk to. There were several weeks, I don't remember how many, when I was ordered to live at the Fritzlar base. I think it was part of an economy measure. But then somehow, I don't remember how it was done, I got back again to, I must have complained all the way to Haber or someone else. The commanding Colonel Sinsel didn't have very much to do with the office. It was run by this Wills or Mills and 3 or 4 very capable NCOs and about a dozen lower ranks.
What do you think would have happened had there not been a chaplain at this point?
When I arrived, the emergency was really over. The time that the chaplains really saved lives was when they got into the concentration camps right there at the beginning. When I arrived, November 47, it was already well past that time. The big problem then, when I arrived, was in getting the people out of Europe. Most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, many of them, as I indicated in my book, wanted to go to the United States, as anybody in his normal right mind would want to do. The others were prepared to go any place. Quite a number went to Israel, and later on got to the United States. Quite a number went to Cuba, and from there to the United States. Well, I forgot to mention Hayes. Hayes was working there also, but apparently Hayes couldn't do anything in Europe itself. The Jews had heard of Hayes and were complaining about it, and there were Hayes people, but I don't think they could arrange for anyone to leave Europe. I think what they did was take care of them after they arrived. Or it may be that after a person got all the papers together, and would usually have to bribe a German clerk $300 or $400 to give you the right papers and documentation, then Hayes might have taken off. Incidentally, there was a lot of other illegality which the official organizations could not give assistance in, but which they would accept after you got a forged document. They had no way of knowing whether it was forged or not.
Well, they wouldn't ask.
But they couldn't forge the document for you.
I see.
I did that on occasion for DPs, forging one type or another. But JDC and Hayes couldn't forge anything.
So, is there any succinct way we can characterize this period of time in terms of the role of the chaplain? In other words, we talked about the beginning part as a time when they saved lives. The second period of time would be characterized as what?
A holding action, I would say.
A holding action.
Keeping the people hopeful, keeping them from killing each other off, or letting themselves become so degraded by the situation that they could not be productive citizens in the future.
And you feel that only a chaplain could have performed that function?
That's hard to say. The DP chaplains were discontinued shortly after I left, because the Army felt that they were no longer needed. And
but while you were there, you felt that it was an important contribution.
Well, I wasn't indispensable. I don't think the chaplains were indispensable either. But we did fill a certain niche. Again, the Army could not have any official Jews other than us. So that we served as ambassadors, if you will. Liaison was the word. Between the United States Army, non-partisan, non-political, non-religious, and people whose main identity was being Jewish. As long as the Army was responsible for the DPs, which they were in my day, they were no longer responsible for feeding. That was taken over by UNRWA, IRO, and Joint and the other welfare organizations. The Army was responsible when I was there for the physical safety and security of the camps. But as long as the army had any contact with a large group of people who were living in what was essentially a Jewish community, and who knew that felt that they were Jews, not Americans and not French and not German, not Russian, not Poles, there had to be somebody who was specifically Jewish to provide a link between the army, which still had control over them, even in a restricted area, and the people. Whether the army could have operated without it, I suppose they could have, but it made it more humane to have this Jewish contact. Now, the people in the DP camps knew that there were Jewish soldiers who would help them from time to time and associate with them. I remember in Frankfurt, there was a fellow who started out as a chaplain's assistant, Steve Katz. Last I heard, he was in Newark, New Jersey. He was a sergeant, I think, who ran the chaplain's office in Frankfurt.
You wouldn't have any idea where he might be and
My
what he was
last
doing?
contact with him was about 20 years ago.
Oh, and that was Newark.
The Jewish Welfare Board might have records. He was working...
Not if just because he was an assistant.
They might, because he was running the Jewish chaplain's office in Frankfurt am Main. There was no chaplain there. There is a record someplace, but how to get it, I don't know. Jewish Welfare Board would be the first to start. The Jewish Welfare Board also had a man, a civilian, working the Jewish Welfare Board office in Frankfurt.
Who is that?
I don't know, maybe a name like Friedman, I don't remember. But the Jewish Welfare Board should have a record of their man
Yeah, okay.
in the Jewish Welfare Board office, say the end of 1947. The office in Frankfurt, they had a service club there.
Mm-hmm.
And this Steve Katz worked very closely with them. Now this Steve Katz got a lot of assistance from other Jewish soldiers for a synagogue in a small city south of Frankfurt. They arranged parties for German Jewish kids, and also for DPs.
Mm-hmm.
They were recognized as being Jewish, especially since he was nominally the head of the Jewish chaplain's office. However, the real official Jew was the chaplain. So that when Steve Katz or a dozen soldiers here and a dozen soldiers there did it, it was more or less in a non-official capacity. When a Jewish chaplain did something, he was recognized as being the official Jewish representative of the army.
I see. Okay. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention about your association with the Jewish Agency?
I found the Jewish Agency people, I listed the names of some of them in my book. Some of them I have maintained contact with, some not. I found them to be the most dedicated of the workers. I don't remember whether any of the people I met were the ones who would exchange identities with DPs. There were those who did that, who would give some DP their identity papers and then join the ranks of the DPs to get people out of the camps.
Mm-hmm.
But on a one-for-one basis like that, it's very hard to increase the population of Palestine or Israel. They worked very closely with the DPs. I have pictures of a school scene with some of them and the children they were working with. They were closer to the DPs, I think, than JDC people. Even though Englard himself was known as a Jew and everything coming from Palestine and being from Germany, he represented an organization that was providing physical assistance. That could come from UNRWA. I think they provided more than the JDC, I don't know for sure, or IRO as was known later on, and other international welfare groups. But the Jewish Agency did specifically Jewish work. Not work for Jews,
right,
but Jewish work.
Mm-hmm.
I have an idea that they also established contact between the political groups in the DP camps and Israel, which gave the people in the camps, I think I point out in my book, I'm not sure, which gave them a feeling of living vicariously in Israel. And there would be shlichim coming back, traveling back and forth of one party or another, so that they felt that they were really Israelis, those who were looking forward to going to Palestine or Israel. They were Israelis temporarily living in the Golan.
Mm-hmm.
But the camp organization And the overt action was such as to give the feeling that this was just a branch of Israel or Palestine. Even though I think most of the DPs harbored the hope of ending up in a secure land, they wouldn't voice it. They would sometimes tell me confidentially.
I mean, you're trying to say that they really didn't want to go to Palestine?
I mention it in that article I gave you, and I think I mention it very subtly in my book, because the story then was that 90% of the Jews wanted to go to Palestine. It was part of the
That's right. That's the myth in
Yeah.
everything.
the myth. Now, what you do with the information is between the tape machine and you. And as I pointed out in that article where I gave you a Xerox copy, these were normal, reasonably normal people. A normal person doesn't go running to a war zone, especially if he's had 10 years of wandering and suffering. The first time, one young man, I think he was originally Czech, asked me to help him get some documents so he could get to the United States. I almost knocked him down. I started yelling at him and everything. And he must have gotten it from somebody else as well. But he explained very calmly, look, Rabbi, what I've been through. Give me a rest. I have this uncle in Chicago, wherever it is. Let me go to the United States for a few years. Let me have some peace and quiet for a few years. Then, if I feel like going to Israel, okay. The Jewish agency, which through its own people and also as the official spokesman, never permitted the American authorities to take a poll of where the DPs wanted to go. And I have a feeling that they also realized that anybody, I went myself to Israel when there was a war on, but they had the feeling that anybody in his right mind, after being through what those people had been through, would want at least a breather. And sometimes people would come to me crying, we don't want to go there. Go there, we're going to get killed by the Arabs. Both before and after the State of Israel was established. Of course, there was fighting both before and after. We don't want to go there. We're going to get killed. We've seen enough war and enough killing. Do we have to go? So there was this fight between the general welfare, if you will, and manifest destiny of the Jewish people. And these people who were not like the people in the United States, but who were caught right there in the middle of who's going to go where. We face the problem now when we get a Jew out of Russia. Do we pay the $3,000 to get a Jew who has nothing but contempt because some of them are like that for Jewish causes, like Panov? First thing he said, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in Zionism, maybe I'll visit Israel. Somebody got a hold of God to visit Israel. Tokenism. But if we get somebody out of Russia, $3,000-4,000, did we take him out? Did we use Jewish funds to take him out so he could settle in Germany or France or even the United States? The same problem arose when Poland, I think it was, had this change of heart and expelled this premier or somebody in Poland who wanted to go to Copenhagen or Denmark or Norway or someplace. Are we as international Jews of Klal Yisrael, are we responsible to save the lives of people such as that, who when they come out, and even before, had absolutely nothing to do for Jewish causes, for Jewish continuity, who like
often the reverse.
Yeah, even a negative, very strongly negative, and not only antithetical, but anti-everything. Do we owe it to them merely because of the fact that their grandparents were Jewish to save them? Are our funds beyond limit, or do we have to concentrate on them? Now, the JDC money was collected in the United States, not to bring Jews to the United States. They did say, those who come to the United States we will take care of. But the money was collected to get people, for whatever reasons, to Palestine or Israel. The group concerned, both the killing of the group and the saving of the group, was for Jewish people in quotation marks, not for this Jew and that Jew. So that if you look at it from the, what you might term the organic point of view of the Jewish people, you face the problem of, is the only one who's going to die to preserve the Jewish people somebody in the front lines of Sinai or Golan Heights? Or do we have the right or the obligation to send the organ back, to get more from the United States to go to Israel? To take somebody who has two options, he can either go to the United States or to Israel, to put pressure on him to go to Israel. Is the klal more significant than the individual?
But it's obvious that from what you're saying, you believe that during this period the Jewish Agency or other Jewish organizations prodded the DPs to go to,
I think in
or gave them no
a
alternative.
large measure of either that, or in a large number of cases, whether majority or minority, there's no way of figuring out, because a lot of the decision-making was done within the hearts of the people I spoke to. They did agitate propaganda, all sorts of, I have pictures of posters that they put up, all sorts of pep talks. The same as the sort of thing we had on a smaller level when I was a kid in the Zionist and the Hakshava group. People would tell us of the need to go to Palestine, build up the people. So that the Jewish Agency did pressure these people because they were fighting a contrary pressure. They're fighting the pressure that these people had, or that many of the people had, to go and live comfortable lives. These people were saved through the efforts of individual Jews, but working in the name of the Jews is what we call Klal Yisrael. Now, whether the Jewish Agency refused to let somebody go to Cuba or the United States, I don't know. I don't think they would have done a thing of that sort. They might have tried to persuade people. They may have made it easier to get to Israel than to wait 3-4 years till you could get onto the border coming to the United States.
Okay, let me just turn this over.